Welcome everyone to Public Service Loan Forgiveness, How to Benefit and How to Preserve It. The National Council of Nonprofits is hosting this webinar with Public Service Promise. Public Service Promise is a new nonprofit organization that was created to help eligible and public servants successfully apply for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, PSLF. Public Service Promise mission is purely educational. It exists only to educate public servants like you about the process of successfully applying for the PSLF program. It does not sell anything. We're very happy to be here with you today. Next slide. I'm Tiffany Gourley Carter, Public Policy Director and Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits. If you have emailed NCN or Googled PSLF and gotten routed to our website, you've probably spoken to me. And if you know anything about PSLF, we are honored to be here today with an absolute expert and genius on PSLF, Betsy Mayotte. She is a leading national voice on student loan forgiveness. She is the founder and president of the Institute of Student Loan Advisors, or TISLA, and she's been recognized by Money Magazine as one of the 50 most influential change makers in America's finances, and served as a primary negotiator for several Title IV rulemaking sessions on student loans. Before I turn it over to her, next slide, I'm going to take a quick minute to share about our network and some housekeeping for today. So NCN consists of about 54 state associations representing about 35,000 nonprofits across the country. We hope that you are tapped into your state associations and into this wonderful network where you will find the best, most relevant, most up-to-date, fastest resources on the nonprofit sector and the work that you are doing in your communities and those that are leading the changes in your community. For some quick housekeeping, next slide, and logistics, we are recording this. We'll send out the recording and the slides to all registrants. All lines are muted. Please use the Q&A function to ask Betsy your questions. She'll be taking breaks throughout today's presentation to make sure she addresses as many questions as possible. But we've had nearly 2,000 registrants, so depending on how many questions, she'll get to as many as she possibly can. And she has a couple colleagues who will also be answering the Q&A box. We also have two fantastic interpreters who will be providing ASL interpretation today. You must go to the interpreter's room to be able to access this. So please do that now if you are going to use that great benefit. Quick disclaimer, I'm a lawyer. Betsy is an absolute expert. We know this. We're not your expert or your lawyer today, though. So we're not providing any individual loan advice, no financial advice, no legal advice, but know that you're going to get a lot of your questions answered today regardless. So we also have resources. We'll provide follow-up information after the webinar. So know that you'll get as many answers as questions answered as possible. So with that, I will turn it over to Betsy.
Thank you, Tiffany. Welcome, everybody. As Tiffany mentioned, this webinar is part of the Public Service Promise project, which is the goal is to help as many people as possible successfully navigate public service loan forgiveness. And part of that is doing webinars like this to explain the rules, the ifs, ands, buts, or maybes, and hopefully turn it into plain English. I just want to reiterate some of the things that Tiffany said a minute ago, because I know people are still logging in. So listen, I am a one-trick pony. My superpower is student loans and nothing else. So we cannot provide you legal advice. We cannot provide you personal financial advice, tax advice. We can answer student loan questions till the cows come home, but that's it. I do encourage you. I have the best other employees at TISLA in our Q&A panel, and they're going to be answering questions along the way. There's a lot of you, there's two of them, and there's only one of me. And if I'm doing my job right, I'm going to answer your question as part of my spiel. So I urge you, I know people are really anxious about this stuff, especially lately, but I urge you to hang back. If you have a question, wait until I cover the topic, and if you still have the question, go for it. But again, I ask you to just hang back and wait until we cover that topic. As I mentioned, Addison and Heather are going to be doing the Q&A right along the way. But if there's a question that's coming up a lot, or if they think that I need to clarify something a little more clearly, I'm going to take a breath every now and again and check in with them and see if there's something that might be great for the whole group. Remember, this is public. This is being recorded. People are going to be watching the recording. So you don't want to be putting any of your personal information into this Q&A. It's nobody's business but yours. At the end of this presentation, you're going to see an email address where you can email your question, and it comes to us, same group, and we'll answer it for free, and it'll just be between us and you. So if your question doesn't get answered, or if it's really personal or really technical, then I urge you to utilize that email address instead. So, and to answer the question that people, it always comes up in webinars over and over again. Yes, this is being recorded. Okay, so here's how we're going to roll. We're going to talk about what PSLF is in the first place, because I am a big fan of understanding the why, because it helps you understand the how. We're going to talk about the eligibility, how to apply for it, and then this is kind of a new topic. We're going to talk about what just happened in the negotiated rulemaking around PSLF from that meeting happened from June 30th to July 2nd. Okay, so what is PSLF? So PSLF was written into law by Congress in 2007. It was actually, a lot of people still call it the Obama Forgiveness Program. Fun fact, it was actually signed into law by Bush II. It's administered by the Department of Education, and the goal of PSLF is to forgive the balance, tax-free. And when I say balance, I mean principal and interest that's left on somebody's loan after they have worked for at least 10 years for an eligible employer while making eligible payments. So if you go back and read the congressional narrative, there's about 207 pages of it. In case you were looking for a new fun summer read, I have read it all. But if you go back and read the congressional narrative for when Congress wrote PSLF into law, by the way, it was a bipartisan initiative. It helps to explain why the rules are the way they are in a big way. So they were looking for a way to encourage people to not only enter into fields of public service, but stay in fields of public service. So a really common question that we get, especially people new to the PSLF thing, is, well, if I only work 5 years, can I get half my loans forgiven? If I only work 2 years, can I get 20% of my loans forgiven? And the answer is no, because again, they're not just looking to encourage people to enter into careers in public service. They're looking for ways to encourage you to stay in fields of public service. And the idea behind it, if you go back again, if you read that congressional narrative over and over and over again, they're citing the same stories they were hearing from their constituents, which were, listen, I want to be a teacher. I want to be a public defender. I want to be a social worker. What a lot of those careers have in common is that you almost always have to get a degree beyond an undergraduate degree to practice in that field. And graduate and professional degrees are where people tend to really rack up the debt. The other thing that careers like that have in common is they tend not to pay well. And overall, people that go into the public sector oftentimes make less than people that go into the private sector. So they were looking for a way to, people that had a passion for public service to be able to get the education they needed to enter into public service and be able to afford to stay in it. So if you sort of keep that origin story in mind, it helps explain and it helps you understand, it helps you remember a lot of the rules that are there for PSLF. Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts. So I mentioned earlier, I think that PSLF gets kind of a bad rap of being overly complicated and hardly anybody gets it. And I call that a factual myth. So remember, PSLF didn't exist until 2007, and you can never get any credit for anything prior to 2007. And right around 2019, 2020 is when people were starting to say, oh, only 1% of people that apply for PSLF get it. Fact, if you look at the data, that was a fact. But the reason I call it a factual myth is that if you look at when the other rules that sort of feed into PSLF were created, it actually makes sense why we didn't start seeing much bigger approval numbers until the last couple years. For one, the the first income driven plan that was really sort of viable and affordable for people didn't get on the books until 2009, so 2 years after PSLF started. And it wasn't until after 2010 that most people started taking out loans that were actually eligible for PSLF in the first place. Prior to 2010, 80 or 90% of the loans that were taken out were under the FFEL program. And as you'll see, those loans aren't eligible. So that's my long-winded way of saying, to lead into the fact that PSLF actually isn't incredibly complicated. If you take it up to not even the 10,000 foot level, the 5,000 foot level, if you just remember these 3 bullet points in front of you, you're going to be able to answer 85% of any question you'll ever have about PSLF. So here are those bullet points. In order for a month to qualify towards the 120 months you need for PSLF, you have to be working at least 30 hours a week for an eligible employer while making an eligible payment on an eligible loan. And I'm going to define all 3 of those eligibles over the next couple minutes. But again, if you remember nothing else that comes out of my mouth for the next 90 minutes, this is what I want you to remember, these 3 bullets. So when you're asking yourself, does a month count? Does it, you need to answer, does it check all 3 of these boxes? Working at least 30 hours a week for an eligible employer while making an eligible payment on an eligible loan. If you're only checking 2 boxes, it doesn't count. If you're only checking 1, it definitely doesn't count. If you're checking none, it definitely doesn't count. So let's start defining those eligibles. So I always like to start with eligible employment because that tends to be where people have the most questions and where there's the most misinformation. It actually doesn't matter at all what you do for a living. What matters is who you work for. So any government employer, whether it be federal, state, local, tribal, that's an eligible employer for PSLF purposes. Any 501c3 nonprofit, that's an eligible employer, full stop. And as you'll see in a minute, there's some other nonprofits that are also eligible, but you have to sort of jump through a couple extra hoops there. Now, you do have to be, in most cases, there is, and you're going to see this with student loans, there's almost always an exception somewhere. In most cases, you do have to be a direct employee of that employer for the employment to count. So in most cases, contractors don't count. If you're an independent contractor, it wouldn't count. If you're working for a for-profit entity, so you might walk into a government building every day, sit at a government desk and answer a government phone. But unless you're a direct employee of that government, it's likely not going to count. Now, you do have to be working eligible employment at the time you make every one of your 120 payments and at the time you actually apply for forgiveness. Now, it used to be that you also had to be working eligible employment at the time that they granted you forgiveness, but they got rid of that rule a couple years ago. So if you're confident that you have your 120 payments and you've submitted your last PSLF certification form, and you're ready to rage quit in a public and entertaining way on TikTok, go ahead and do it. Most people like to wait until they get what we call the green banner or the golden letter or just seeing their balance to 0. But the regulations don't require that. As long as you were working eligible employment at the time of all 120 payments and at the time you actually applied for forgiveness, you can go on your merry way. So a little more clarity to the overview I did about what an eligible employer is. So as I mentioned, any government employer counts, federal, state, local, or tribal. That includes being full-time in the military, Peace Corps, AmeriCorps. Any 501c3 nonprofit, full stop, eligible. As I mentioned, there's other nonprofits that aren't 501c3s that qualify, and they only qualify if their primary reason for existence is one of the things you see on the 2 bulleted lists in front of you. So emergency management, public health, public interest law. This is a finite list. If the primary function of your organization is not on this list, and they're not a 501c3 or government organization, it is not eligible. Let me give you an example I like to use. So let's say you work for an animal shelter, and the animal shelter is a nonprofit, but they're not a 501c3. And it just so happens that the animal shelter, and maybe this is your job at the animal shelter, they offer free classes to the public on things like dog CPR and pet first aid and, cat grooming. Arguably, that's public education, right? And I wouldn't argue with you that it was public education. But that animal shelter is not going to qualify for PSLF because their primary reason for being is not these classes. Their primary reason for being is rescuing animals. So in that scenario, that particular nonprofit wouldn't count. Now, if it so happened that that animal shelter ended up switching their nonprofit status to being a 501c3, nothing else changed. The fact that their main function was rescuing animals is still their primary function. The fact that they're now a 501c3 means that they are now an eligible employer. But until that point, that it wouldn't count. Another example I like to use just to really hammer this home is when I say that it doesn't matter at all what you do for a living, I mean it. I like to use a public school system as an example there. If you were to poll the teachers with student loans that worked for a public school system, I guarantee you that the vast majority of them would be aware that that they were potentially PSLF eligible. However, if you were to poll everybody else at that in that public school system, the cafeteria workers, the groundskeepers, the administrative assistants, the principal, the art teacher, they're generally not as aware. But the fact of the matter is they're all equally potentially eligible for PSLF because again, it doesn't matter what you do for a living. What matters is that your employer is an eligible employer. Now, I want to go back to a couple of sort of footnotes here. It used to be until a couple years ago that adjunct professors at colleges and universities sort of got the short end of the stick because very rarely were adjuncts considered full-time employees. So two things have changed. One, you don't have to be classified as a full-time employee with the employer anymore as long as you're working at least 30 hours a week. By the way, that 30 hours a week doesn't have to all be for the same employer. If you work for two PSLF eligible employers, 15 hours a week each, that qualifies. So the 30 hours doesn't all have to be under a single employer. The other thing they changed is how they calculate adjuncts. So now adjuncts, instead of asking the employer to certify that they're working at least 30 hours a week, they ask how many credits that the adjunct is teaching. And then they multiply that number of credits by 3.35. And if that equals at least 30, then they're considered to have met the definition of full-time under PSLF, which is at least that 30 hours a week. The other exception I wanted to talk about, so I mentioned, and I said it with passion and vigor, that you have to be directly working for an eligible employer for it to count. The contractors don't count. The one exception to that, and this is a fairly recent rule, apparently there are some states, Texas and California, for example, that for some reason state law prohibits nonprofit hospitals from directly hiring physicians. So what those hospitals do is they create two arms to the hospital. It's still one hospital, but they have a nonprofit arm and they have a for-profit arm. And the for-profit arm ends up hiring the doctors, and the doctors actually do all their work under the nonprofit and PSLF eligible arm of the hospital. In that scenario, that employment counts, but only because state law actively and specifically prohibits the nonprofit arm from doing the direct hiring. Here in Massachusetts, it's very common for hospitals to have a nonprofit arm and a for-profit arm, and the for-profit arm hires some people and the nonprofit arm hires others. There is no law in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that directly prohibits the nonprofit arm of the hospital from directly hiring those particular types of employees. So here in Massachusetts, those employees would have to be working for the nonprofit arm of the hospital in order to get PSLF credit. But Texas and California, and there's some other states, I think Kansas might be one of them. I don't have all the states that have such state laws memorized, but California and Texas, that scenario would count for those particular borrowers. Now, labor unions never count for PSLF. Partisan political organizations never count for PSLF. Nonprofits that aren't 501c3s and whose primary reason for being is not on that list that I showed you a few minutes ago, not eligible for PSLF. And again, in 95% of the cases, unless you are in a state where such a law exists, you have to be a direct employee of the eligible employer. Now, how do you tell if your employer is eligible? Well, first of all, your employer probably knows. HR and your fellow employees probably already know if they're PSLF eligible. But if you work for a smaller employer, it's possible that no one at your organization may have applied yet. The best way to do it is to use what's called the PSLF help tool, which is located at studentaid.gov. Now, that is where you're going to submit your certification of past employment. And, speaking of past employment, another common question we get is, oh my goodness, I worked for an eligible employer 12 years ago and I never certified it. Is it too late? Nope, it's not too late. It never goes stale. We do strongly recommend that you get in the habit of certifying your employment on an annual basis. And technically, you're not required to. If you want to wait, if your middle name is Danger and you want to wait until you think you've hit that 120 and then submit all your employment at once, have at it. If it all goes through and gets approved, good for you. But that's dangerous. And the reason it's dangerous is a couple things. And I've run into this so many times and it keeps me up at night. You might change employers and your employer, back in the day, people kept records forever. In today's world, in 2025, if you have a halfway decent legal department and information security area, they're telling your employer to get rid of records as soon as feasibly possible to lower the information security risk. And I have run into people who have not been able to get employment certified because their employer no longer has the records from when they worked there, and therefore they're unable to certify the employment. Also, employers can close or they can merge with another one. So again, while not required, we do strongly recommend you get in the habit of certifying your employment on an annual basis. But if you do have an employer that you worked at back in 2008, you can go ahead and submit it. Just as a reminder, nothing prior to October 07 can count because PSLF didn't exist then. Now, if anyone at your organization has ever applied for PSLF before, then your employer is already going to be in the PSLF help tool database. And that makes your life and your anxiety level really easy because when you go to fill out the form online, it'll say, yep, they're already approved. But if no one has sort of gone that route from your employer yet, that it's going to have to go through review at the Department of Education. So the PSLF vendor doesn't do the initial employer approvals. The servicers don't do the initial employer approvals. It's literally like one or two guys at the Department of Education that do the initial employer approvals. Once the employer is approved, it doesn't have to be approved every time someone applies. It's just sort of a one-shot thing. I'm going to warn you right now, if your employer is not already in the database, you're going to have to put your patience pants on because it can take up to a year for a new employer to get certified. There's no way to fast track that. So please don't file complaints. I mean, there's plenty of things to file complaints about these days, but that's not one of them. It's always been like that. It's always only been one or two people that have the power to do the approvals. They get through their list slow but steady, but it's slow. So again, you're going to have to put your patience pants on. Okay, so we've covered our first eligible. So let's talk about our next eligible is what is an eligible student loan? So, as I think you've already seen, there's usually for student loans, there's a short answer and a long answer. So the short answer, an eligible student loan is any federal direct loan. That can be a direct Stafford loan, subsidized or unsubsidized, a direct Grad Plus loan, a direct Parent Plus loan. Doesn't matter when the loan was made. If you have a vintage with a nice patina on it, direct loan from 1994, which is when they made the very first one, that is just as potentially eligible for PSLF as a bright and shiny new 2025 direct loan. Now, there are other federal loans that aren't eligible at their face, but can be made eligible by consolidating them. Those are any loans under the Federal Family Education Loan Program, which was, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of loans that were made prior to 2010. Perkins loans, HEAL loans, loans for disadvantaged students. If you consolidate them, they then become into the direct loan program. They then become eligible for PSLF. But unless you did that consolidation prior to 2024, June of 2024, you're going to be starting from scratch. So any payments you made prior to, if you were to consolidate a FFEL loan today, you'd still have 10 years in front of you. The Biden administration did some really awesome waivers, which is why people that consolidated prior to June of 2024 were, in some cases, able to get credit for periods when their loans were FFEL or Perkins. But that, fortunately, that ship has sailed and that ship is not coming back to this port. So if you do have those loans, you're going to want to run some numbers to see if it makes sense to consolidate into direct loans and start your PSLF journey. Private loans, institutional loans, which are loans where the school is the actual lender. State loans, like here in Massachusetts, we have this mass no interest loan. Those are never eligible for PSLF. There is no magic rain dance you can do to make them eligible for PSLF. Even if your private loan used to be a federal loan and for whatever reason you decided to refinance it into a private, there is no take backsies and there's nothing you can do to make it PSLF eligible again. So, yeah. If you're not sure what kind of loans you have, you can log on to studentaid.gov and look at loan details. And so the thing about FFEL and Direct is it can be a little confusing because both FFEL and Direct have Stafford loans, both FFEL and Direct have Grad Plus and Parent Plus and consolidation. If you took the loan out after July of 2010, it's a direct loan. If it's a Stafford or a Plus loan or a consolidation. If you took it out before July of 2010, it could be either one. So you're gonna wanna make sure. And your servicer can tell you, or again, if you log into studentaid.gov, it'll say the word direct in front of it, or it'll say FFEL in front of it, one or the other. All right, so we've covered two of our eligibles. We know what an eligible employer is. It's eligible employment is working at least 30 hours a week for any government employer, any 501c3, or in some cases, other nonprofits that aren't 501c3s whose primary reason for being is one of those bullet points. We know what an eligible loan is. It's any federal direct loan, regardless of when it was made. By the way, loans that are in default cannot get credit for PSLF until they're out of default. So if your loans are in default, you're going to want to go to studentaid.gov or go to our website, freestudentloanadvice.org, and look up how to get out of default. I am going to take a breath and check in with Addison and see if there's any questions regarding eligible employment or eligible loan that need further clarification or that I just forgot about altogether.
Thanks, Betsy. We did have a number of questions about different types of eligible employers and whether faith-based organizations may or may not count.
Yeah, so it used to be, so it's not that faith-based organizations didn't count in the past, but it used to be you had to subtract any religious activities you did from your employment hours. So if you, if you worked 30 hours a week for an employer and 5 of those hours were spent teaching Sunday school, you'd have to subtract those 5 hours from the number of hours you worked. But they got rid of that rule. So the rules apply at faith-based organizations. They say the same as they do for all other employers now. Anything else I should cover before we go on to our third and last eligible?
Not for this topic set.
Okay, thanks. All right, our last eligible. What's an eligible payment? So an eligible payment is one that is made on or after October 1st, 07 on an eligible plan while you were working eligible employment. So remember those 3 check boxes I said to remember at the beginning of this presentation. Now, again, we've got a short answer and a long answer. So an eligible plan is either your 10-year standard repayment plan, which is the plan you're put into if you don't actively pick a plan and if you don't consolidate when you first go into repayment when you get out of school. or any of the income-driven repayment plans. Now, if your loan is consolidated, you might be on a standard plan, but that almost never counts for PSLF because a consolidation loan doesn't have a 10-year term. The term on a consolidation loan is between 12 and 30 years. So that's why the standard plan, if your loan is consolidated, in most cases doesn't count towards PSLF. So people who have a consolidated loan, they really need to get on an income-driven repayment plan. Now, the other thing I want to mention about the 10-year standard, yes, 10-year standard plan counts. However, if you make 120 payments under 10-year standard plan, you're going to pay the loan off. So most people, now we've had some weird things happen the past few years. We had the COVID pause. The COVID pause counted towards PSLF, even though no one was making payments, assuming you had a direct loan and were working eligible employment. We've had some little bits and pieces of forbearance here and there since then that have counted towards PSLF. But it is people that are just starting their PSLF journey, you really need to get on. You're going to need to get on an income-driven plan to really benefit from PSLF. So let's talk about the eligible plans. So the plans in front of you, the ones in orange, for the most part, do not count for PSLF. I say for the most part because there's a little clause that says, like, say you were on the graduated repayment plan or the extended repayment plan or standard consolidation, and it just so happened that your payment amount was the equivalent or more than what you would have been making, what you would have paid under the 10-year standard, they'll count it. That almost never happens. So if you're on one of those plans, you almost certainly need to get off of that plan. And as I mentioned, any of the income-driven plans count for PSLF. That's old IBR, new IBR, pay-as-you-earn. Now, the pay-as-you-earn plan, people can still get on it, but you're going to have to switch plans by July 1st of 2028 because the recent budget reconciliation bill is phasing out the pay-as-you-earn plan. Now, let me just get this out of the way now. There is nothing that will reset your PSLF counts. There used to be a lot of trap doors. If you do this, you got to start at 0 again. If you do this, I'm so sorry, we're taking credits away from you. There's almost nothing that will take away your credits now. If you consolidate loans that already have PSLF credits, that doesn't even bring you to 0 anymore. What they do is they end up giving you a weighted average of the PSLF credits you already have on the underlying loans. But if you switch plans, it doesn't matter which plan you switch from. It will not reset your counts. Full stop. If you leave your public service job and go back to one later, it will not reset your count. If you default and then come out of default, any PSLF credits you got prior to default will still be there waiting for you, waiting to give you a hug and welcome you back into your PSLF journey. So, so getting back to I bring that up because it comes up a lot when I talk about people are going to have to switch plans. So old IBR, new IBR count, and they're not going away for existing borrowers. The pay-as-you-earn plan, you can still apply for it. They'll give it to you, but you're going to have to come out of it by July 1st, 2028, or they're going to kick you out of it and put you on something else. The SAVE plan is gone. It was either going to be the courts or Congress. Congress did it. It's still sort of on life support with the courts, but nobody can apply for it anymore, and I don't expect anybody to get credit for any future SAVE payments. SAVE plan used to be called the Repay plan. Payments on the Repay plan also count. Income contingent repayment. You can apply for it today. You can stay on it till July 1st of 2028, and then you're going to have to pick another plan, or they're going to pick one for you. And then there's a new plan coming on the scene that's going to be available by next summer called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or the RAP. And payments under the RAP also count for PSLF. But there's a caveat to that. So it used to be in order for a payment to count for PSLF, it had to be made on time. And on time was defined as within 15 days of the due date. They got rid of that rule a couple years ago. So now your payment can be late, but as long as you make it and all the other rules apply, it'll count for PSLF. However, when Congress wrote into the RAP plan into the law, they specifically put that payments made under the RAP have to be on time. Now, they didn't define what on time meant, but I suspect, if I had to guess, that when the Department of Education writes the regulations around this, they'll probably define it the way they used to define it, as within 15 days of the due date. I also wouldn't be surprised. I'm not saying for sure that's what's going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if when they did that, they also might reinstitute the on time rule for future payments under the other plans. But as of right now, I mean, I hope you're not late on your payments, but if you are, it doesn't mean you've automatically lost PSLF credit under these other plans. But for the RAP, it'll definitely have to be on time. Now, this is speaking, talked about trapdoors a minute ago. There's a new trapdoor that you need to be aware of. So all these plans that I talked about here, other than, they're phasing out pay as you earn, they're phasing out income contingent repayment in 2028. But if you have loans today, you're grandfathered into all these other plans that you see in front of you, unless you borrow anything anything federal student loan wise on or after July 1st of 2026. That includes if you consolidate, on or after July 1st, 2026. So let's say you have $100,000 in loans today and you plan on going back to school in a couple years. If you do that, you're still going to be eligible for PSLF, but you will no longer be eligible for old IBR, new IBR, or those other plans, because the new loan you take out on or after July 1st, 2026 is going to contaminate all your existing loans. That includes for our Parent Plus borrowers. That includes if you consolidate on or after July 1st, 2026. So if the new RAP plan is going to be a lot more expensive for you monthly than the existing IBR plans, you're going to want to think very carefully before you borrow again on or after July 1st, 2026. Now, for those that do borrow or consolidate on or after that date, you're only going to have two plans available to you: the new RAP plan or what we're calling the new standard plan. So no one's going to get a 10-year standard anymore unless they only owe 25 grand or less. If they borrowed between 25 and 50, it'll be a 15-year standard. Between 50 and 100, it'll be a 20-year standard. And over 100 will be a 25-year standard. And remember, under the standard plan, it only counts for PSLF if it's the equivalent of a 10-year standard. So you're really going to have to be on the RAP plan to get any payments to qualify for PSLF. I want to add an extra caution for Parent Plus borrowers. So right now, Parent Plus borrowers, if you consolidate, preferably definitely before July 1st, 2026, you can then get on income contingent repayment. And then come 2028, when they phase out ICR, they're going to grandfather you into income-based repayment. But if you have children that are still in school, or you have other children that are going to be going to school, and so you're going to have to keep borrowing Parent Plus loans on or after July 1st, 2026, and you were planning on counting on PSLF, you're going to have to think this through. Because again, if you, they are not letting Parent Plus borrowers of any flavor, of any age, into the RAP program at all. Which means, although technically Parent Plus loans remain eligible for PSLF, there's really no way for any Parent Plus borrower that borrows on or after that 7/1/26 date, there's really no way for you to achieve PSLF, because you're going to be barred from all the plans that would help you accrue eligible payments. So again, if you have Parent Plus loans now, or any other loans for that matter, and you were counting on PSLF for Parent Plus loans, the only sort of loophole that's out there is have the other parent do the rest of the borrowing on or after 7/1/26, so that at least the loans that are in your name will maintain eligibility for those income-driven plans on the older loans. A little bit real quick about the way the RAP plan is going to work. The RAP plan is, again, it's based on income. It's based on your adjusted gross income. And if you're married and you file your taxes jointly, they will also include your spouse's income in the calculation. If you're married and file your taxes separately, they will only use your income. And that applies to all the income-driven plans, by the way. Under the RAP, if your income is $10,000, your AGI is less than $10,000, they're going to use your payment's going to be $120 a year, which works out to $10 a month. If your income is between $10,000 and $20,000, they're going to use 1% of your adjusted gross income, divide by 12. That's your monthly payment amount, and so on and so forth. It caps off if your AGI is over 100,000, and it caps at 10% of your AGI. And again, you divide that number by 12, and that's going to be your monthly payment amount. Now, if you have dependent children, they're going to subtract $50 from that. Now, one of the things we're still waiting for guidance on from the department is whether that $50 per kid comes off of the annual amount or comes off the monthly amount. And the experts are pretty heavily mixed on that. So that I'm calling that a wait and see, and we'll have to see what the Department of Ed's guidance is over whether that $50 per child comes off of the annual or comes off the monthly amount. We already talked about that. All right. So I mentioned that the SAVE plan is in the courts. There's another hearing about it coming up in a couple weeks on August 4th. Anybody who was on the SAVE plan has been in forbearance limbo. And we recently found out, so that's been an interest-free forbearance, but we recently found out they're going to start accruing interest on that forbearance starting August 1st. So to be clear, if you're in that forbearance, you're still not going to be due for payment, but they are going to start accruing interest on it again. Now, listen, if you're pursuing PSLF and you're pretty sure you're going to get it, who cares? Because they're going to forgive the interest anyway. So I've had a lot of borrowers approach us here at TSLA and say, I'm pursuing PSLF. I'm freaked out that the interest is going to start accruing again. Can I just pay the interest along the way? And my answer to that is, yep. Or you could also take that money, go out on your patio and light it on fire and toast marshmallows over it. Because if you're pursuing PSLF or any type of forgiveness, you should not be paying a penny more than you're required, because you're literally just throwing money away. And making payments during the safe forbearance doesn't make those months count towards PSLF. So, people that are on the safe forbearance, they have two choices. They can either ride out the forbearance for as long as it's available. I personally think it's going to end sometime in the next year. I don't think they are going to drag it out to 2028, but that's pure speculation on my part. And then if you do that, you can use what's called buyback to get those saved forbearance months to count. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about buyback in a second. Or you can switch to another income-driven plan now. Money-wise, it's going to be a wash, because the way they calculate buyback is with the next lowest income-driven plan that you would have been eligible for if you weren't in this non-eligible status. And right now, they appear to be using the old repay formula, which is 10% of your AGI, which is what your payment would be under new IBR pays you earn anyway. So again, the amount of money that you'd be paying is probably going to be about the same, whether you choose to do buyback or whether and pay it all in a lump sum down the line, or whether you switch plans now and start accruing active payments now. You can no longer apply for SAVE. It's not even on the form anymore, but you can apply for other IDR plans. If you submitted an application for a new IDR plan more than like 3 or 4 months ago, you might want to consider submitting a new application. There's some servicers that have said, if you applied before April, just send us a new application. Applications were on pause for months because of the SAVE litigation. And last we saw, there was still over 1 million waiting to be processed in the queue. And we also recently were told that there's about 500,000 pending applications that are basically going to be tossed and canceled because those are people that checked the box that said, just give me the lowest plan. And because of the whole SAVE litigation nonsense, they can't really do that. So they're sort of tossing those applications. So if your application's dusty and you submitted it before, say, March or April, I would consider submitting a new one. Talked about the safe forbearance. I talked about April. All right, a little bit more about buyback. So you can't utilize buyback until you have 120 months of certified employment. So it's nothing you can do now unless you're at the 120. And then there's a procedure that's outlined on studentaid.gov, but basically you're saying, hey, I have these months of, say, safe forbearance or in-school deferment, for example. And I want you to tell me how much, if I'd been making payments instead of being in forbearance or being in that deferment, how much would have paid? How much would I have paid? And you have to submit proof of what your income was during those months that you're trying to buy back. They'll do some magic math and they'll make you an offer, and you have to pay it all at once. So let's say your payment would have been $300 a month and you're trying to buy back 10 months. They're going to send you a bill for $3,000. You don't have to pay it. You could be like, I'm all set. I'm going to keep trying to accrue payments going forward. Or you make that $3,000 payment, they make those months count, and you get your forgiveness. So that's up to you. Now, as I mentioned, right now, you can't submit for buyback until you already have 120. I've heard chatter the Department of Ed may change that. They may start allowing people to do buyback before they've hit the 120. We'll see. We're short on time today, so I can't go into detail about there's something called the TEPSLF. The TEPSLF is the temporary extension of public service loan forgiveness. It can allow payments made under normally ineligible plans, so extended graduated standard consolidation to count. But there's a bunch of ifs, ands, buts, or maybes to it. Again, we are short on time. It's not going to, most people it won't benefit, but it might benefit some. You can read about the TEPSLF at studentaid.gov, or you can read about it on our website, which is freestudentloanadvice.org. There's an especially wonky and tricky rule at the end that for your last 12 payments. So if you think the TEPSLF might benefit you, you're going to want to read that part really carefully. And if you have questions, again, you can always email us. There are some deferments that count towards PSLF as long as you had an eligible loan and were working eligible employment at the time. Those are cancer deferments, economic hardship, any of the military deferments of forbearances, AmeriCorps forbearance, National Guard, and then there's that processing forbearance, which a lot of people have been getting lately, which is if the servicer can't process your income-driven plan in a timely way, they put this 60-day processing forbearance on, and that can count as well. Okay, so we've defined all our eligibles. We know what eligible employment is. It's working at least 30 hours a week for any government employer, federal, state, local, or tribal, any 501c3, or in some cases, another nonprofit that's not a 501c3 whose reason for existence is one of the finite bullet points I put on the earlier slide. An eligible loan is any direct loan, whether it be a Stafford loan, a Grad Plus, Parent Plus, consolidation. An eligible payment is a payment made under a 10-year standard or any of the income-driven plans. Payments made or employment performed prior to October 07 never counts. Payments made while in default never count. And it's almost impossible to lose your existing count. Now, as I mentioned, the best way to sort of progress towards PSLF is to use the PSLF help tool. It's all electronic. It'll send a notification to your employer to start to sign off on your form. And the new PSLF vendor has been working fairly quickly. So it's all, there's not a lot of exchanging of paper through the mail like there used to be. And there used to be a lot of long delays for employment certification approval. We don't see that nearly as often anymore. We do certifying employment is always retroactive. Even if you know you are never going to leave your employer, stuff happens. Maybe you win the lottery tomorrow. Maybe, and this would be not so good thing, maybe you get laid off. Maybe you get ill. And that's why you could never certify employment that you haven't worked at. It's always retroactive and it never goes stale as long as it's on or after October of 07. All right, so we've covered all the rules for PSLF. The next thing I'm gonna talk about is the negotiated rulemaking that just happened a few weeks ago. But before I do that, I can see from the numbers that keep moving around in the Q&A section that there might be some more questions we need to cover. So I am going to take a sip of water and check in with my buddy Addison again.
Yeah, we've gotten lots of questions about buyback and when people are eligible, and also going back to employment eligibility. One really good question, if someone was employed but didn't take a paycheck, do those months count?
This might be, I got to be careful here because I don't want to tiptoe into legal issues, but I think you have to be paid to be considered an employee. I might be wrong on that though. But if you're considered to have worked at least 30 hours a week for that employer, and they're willing to certify it to that effect, then they don't, it doesn't matter how much you were paid. But I think law requires that you be paid at least minimum wage. Otherwise, you're a volunteer, and volunteering does not count. Um, Heather, I know you've also been typing fast and furious in the Q&A. Were there any questions you came across you thought might be good for the whole group?
Yes, I saw a few that wonder about the longevity of the buyback program, if there's any risk to it.
Yeah, people are worried about that. I have not seen any indication that there's an interest of getting rid of buyback. The negotiated rulemaking session that we just got through the meeting, I actually submitted a proposal to make buyback better. And the Department of Ed didn't give any indication that they had any, if they were going to get rid of buyback, they would have done it as part of that neg reg. So at least for the immediate future, there's no risk. The other thing you need to know is that regulations can never be retroactive. So, I definitely think it's safe for the moment, but let's say 4 years. And by the way, now that they've just done a neg reg for PSLF, they're probably not going to touch PSLF again for a while, like years. So let's say 4 or 5 years from now, they do another negotiated rulemaking, and this time they're like, this buyback thing is nonsense. We're going to get rid of it. If they did, it could only be prospective. So borrowers would still be able to utilize it for past payments. So, for right now, you're good. But remember, for most people, whether you use buyback or whether you change plans now, like if that question was germinating from someone on the safe forbearance trying to decide whether to switch plans now, for most people, money-wise, it's going to be a wash. So if even the sound of my voice has not soothed you on the availability of buyback in the future, just switch plans now. And again, it shouldn't cost you any more money in the long run. Anything else on PSLF eligibility or how to apply or anything like that from Addison and Heather before I move on to neg reg?
Nothing else from me, Betsy.
Nothing else for me.
All right, thanks. I'm going to do one more call for questions at the very, 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 very end. Regarding PSLF eligibility. Okay, let's talk about negotiated rulemaking. All right. What is neg reg? So the Secretary of Education and a lot of agencies are required by law, by federal law, to go through a process in most cases called negotiated rulemaking. And the way it works, like when it works well, it's actually kind of a beautiful thing. And it requires the secretary, like if you're going to change a regulation, you need to get someone representing all the groups that might be affected by this regulatory change in a room and go over the regulatory language with them and try to come up with the best regulatory language you can that will hopefully positively affect the constituents, all the constituencies that are going to be affected by this regulation. regulations cannot be contrary to federal law, and they cannot be retroactive. Now, I've been a negotiator for a student loan related negotiated rulemaking 5 or 6 times, and I was chosen as a negotiator for this negotiated rulemaking. The way NEGREG works is if the group is able to come to consensus on the draft regulatory language that they develop as part of these series of meetings, then the Department of Education is required by law to publish that exact language, every cross T, every punctuation mark, in what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a really fancy way of saying a draft regulation. So the way it works is they get all the negotiators together that represent all the constituencies. They say, hey, these are the changes we want to make to the regs. What do you think? The negotiators go, yay, and brr, and brr. And then hopefully they come to a compromise. And if they come to consensus and agree on the language, a month or two later, the Department of Ed publishes that language word for word. The public, which means you, and it means me, and it means that guy, and it means that girl, they can all comment. You submit written comments. The Department of Ed's required to look at every one of them. And then based on those comments, they come out with the final version of the regulation a couple months later. If the group doesn't come to consensus, the Department of Education can write whatever they want. So even if the group agreed to 99 out of the 100 words and one guy disagreed with that last word, the department doesn't even have to use those first 99 words that everybody agreed on. So spoiler alert, this NEGREG, we did not come to consensus, and it's my fault. I was the one who said no. And I'm going to explain why, a little bit of the why going forward. So where this NEGREG, the origin story of this NEGREG was back in March, the White House issued an executive order requesting that the Secretary of Education write regulations that would remove PSLF eligibility from employers who were found to have, quote, engaged in substantial illegal purpose. Now, remember a minute ago when I said that regulations cannot be contrary to federal law? Neither can executive orders. And if you go back into the law, and for those of you that like to nerd out on this stuff, I'll help you out. The section of the law that PSLF is in is section 455 little m. And if you read the definition of an eligible employer under 455M, it clearly states that a government employer is eligible and a 501c3 employer is eligible. The other nonprofits are a little more convoluted, but 501c3s in government, there's no like iffy language around it. It's just sort of clear cut. So that makes that executive order legally, in my opinion, so remember, I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice, but in my opinion and other people's opinions, legally questionable in the first place. But the Department of Education was following the executive order requirements, and they created this NEGREG to write regulations around how they would potentially remove PSLF status from what would otherwise be an eligible employer. In their proposal, they came to us when we started the meeting. They had some draft language already written, and they defined substantial legal purpose as it's restricted to the things you see in front of you. So it doesn't mean drunk driving, which that's obviously illegal, but that wouldn't apply here. It doesn't, breaking and entering is also illegal, but that's not what they're talking about here. They're defining substantial legal purpose for PSLF purposes as violations of federal immigration law, supporting terrorism, gender related medical care on minors, illegal discrimination, and violating state laws specifically related to protests. So trespassing, disorderly conduct, public nuisance, vandalism, obstruction of highways. So at face value, you might say, well, of course, if there's an employer that is supporting terrorism, then, maybe they shouldn't be PSLF eligible. The problem here is that first of all, again, federal law under PSLF doesn't have any exclusionary language around government employers and 501c3 nonprofits being eligible for PSLF. The other issue here is that the way in the proposal, the Department of Education was proposing removing PSLF status from such an employer. And basically, they're trying to give themselves the authority to do that. So there were in the proposal, there's 4 ways an employer could lose eligibility if they supposedly were engaging in these limited substantial illegal activities. One is if there was a judicial proceeding where the judge went, yeah, you engaged in substantial illegal activity. Another would be a settlement where the employer went, yeah, I engaged in substantial illegal activity. Or if there was part of a court proceeding and there was ended up being a guilty plea where, again, the employer went, yeah, I engaged in substantial illegal activity. The 4th way is the Secretary of Education going, yep, no soup for you. I've decided on my own that there's clear and convincing evidence that you engaged in this substantial illegal activity. So my issue with that is that I don't think, never mind the fact of whether the proposal is legal in the first place, but I don't think that it's the Department of Education's, I don't think they have the authority, and I don't think it's their wheelhouse to determine if an entity broke the law, especially in areas of law that are outside of higher education. So while I firmly believe that this is going to go to court regardless, I spent my time trying to really get them to, keep the judicial proceeding, keep the other 2 ways where the employer owns it, but remove the arguably arbitrary authority of the secretary to say, yeah, I'm mad at you, and I think you've engaged in substantial illegal activity. And they refused to do it. It was a non-starter for them, and that's why I ultimately ended up voting. Well, they were at the end, they were actually asking me to abstain from voting, because if I had abstained from voting, then the other negotiators could have still gotten consensus. And it was really, really important to the Department of Education to get consensus on this. But I ended up not even being willing to abstain. I wanted to be on the record as voting no, because A, I don't think the proposal is legal, and B, I don't think it's the secretary's place to make the determination of those areas of substantial illegal activity. So what does this mean for you? Well, nothing right now. Remember, first of all, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I really do think that this whole regulation will end up getting thrown out in court. I'll be very shocked if it isn't. Number 2, remember that regulations can't be retroactive. And the Department of Ed even said on the record clearly multiple times that if this were to go through, it would only apply to so-called illegal activities that occurred on or after July 1st, 2026. So nothing that may have happened in the past. And there's going to be a process in place for the employer to defend themselves and so on and so forth. So this, any employer potentially losing their eligibility isn't going to happen anytime soon, if it happens at all, which again is a big if. Nobody should be panicking or making any changes to their student loan strategy based on this proposal at all. This is a watch and see. And, if your employer, remember, the activities have to be illegal by law, even under this proposal. So, a question we're getting often after this NAGREG is, I work at a hospital and we do gender affirming care for teenagers in our hospital. Is it against your state's law for you to do that? Usually I've never had anyone say anything other than no, that it's not against the law in my state. Well, then you don't have anything to worry about. Now, with that said, one of the things that sort of helped me in my decision is that on June 30th, the Department of Ed issued a press release accusing Harvard University of, I quote, violently violating discrimination laws. So if there's situations like that people are going to have to sort of watch, and see how they play out is I guess what I'm going to say about that. But again, repeating myself, this is not retroactive. I would be very surprised if it didn't get thrown out, like very, very surprised if it didn't get thrown out in court in the first place. And if it's gonna, and oh, and if on the slim chance your employer is considered, loses their PSLF status under this, if all my predictions do not come to fruition, and the worst happens, and your employer loses PSLF status, it's going to be prospective only. Any credits that you'd already accrued up to the date that the Department of Ed removed their status are still yours, and they're yours forever, and no one can take them away from you. And then if once your employer gets their status back, you'll be able to accrue credits again moving forward. You just wouldn't be able to get credit for anything in that period where they weren't considered eligible. Now, I'm sure there are questions here. So, Addison, what do you think are the big ones that around this you think I should address?
Well, the big one right now seems to be, will the Q&A be included with the presentation that gets sent out?
I don't know the answer to that.
This is Tiffany. I don't believe we have that ability. So we will be providing the resources and all of the slides and the recording, but I don't think we can do the Q&A. We'll look into it if we can, though.
All right, thank you. Nothing around Greg, Addison?
No, let's see. There's a lot of comments thanking you for standing up for democracy and borrowers. We have a question about the department originally proposed a preponderance of evidence standard. Do we expect them to adopt the clear and convincing standard or some different standard?
I'm actually not sure where they're going to go, what direction they're going to go. What I know they won't is, so at the last minute they tried to offer me to try to get me to abstain. They offered to change it to severe and pervasive. I don't think they're going to keep that one, but I honestly don't know if they're going to do clear and convincing or preponderance. In the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure how much it matters. I mean, I know there's a difference between those two, but in the end, if this were to go through the way it would be used, I'm not sure how much it would matter. Heather, what about you? Anything? Actually, before I pass it along to Tiffany for a call to action about this, I'm gonna just check for overall questions from Heather and Addison one more time, but I just want to remind you, if you still have questions, you can email them to pslf1@freestudentloanadvice.org. We try to answer questions within a business day. You can read up more about PSLF if you're more of a visual learner than an auditory learner. Publicservicepromise.org/resources, freestudentloanadvice.org, studentaid.gov, all good places for to read about the rules for PSLF. And yeah, so Heather, I'll check with you first, and then I'll end with Addison. Any questions about anything that you think I should address before I pass this off to Tiffany?
Sure, a more general question. I saw one or two employers ask how they can help get their employees PSLF, how they can make it more available to.
I love that question. So, and I love it because in my experience, employers that do even just a little bit of hand-holding with their employees, it benefits them as well as the employees. So, it depends on what level of help you want to give them. If you want to reach out to Public Service Promise and do a webinar just for your employees, I'm sure they're happy to talk to you about it. Here at TISLA, we actually created a program called PSLF Peace of Mind that is specifically for PSLF employers to be able to help their employees. And we've had a lot of success and really, really good feedback on that program. So if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to TISLA, and I can send you a quick brochure about it. It's pretty inexpensive too. Addison, last chance.
A couple questions about whether the Department of Education is going to get dissolved and what impact that may have.
So the White House doesn't have the authority to do that. Congress would, it would take an act of Congress to get rid of the Department of Education. And, you know, I don't know if they would have been able to do that because of the Byrd rule under budget reconciliation anyway. But, you know, the court case about the layoffs is still ongoing in Boston. I know people I know we had a Supreme Court decision a couple weeks ago, and people interpreted that to mean that some people interpreted that to mean that the department could do more layoffs, or that it was decided that they had the authority to do the layoffs in the first place. And that actually isn't what the SCOTUS decision was. The SCOTUS decision, so the court case in Boston over the authority to do the layoffs in the first place is still ongoing. But the Boston court had said, you can't lay these people off officially until this is done. They basically put an injunction on it. I might be using the wrong term. Forgive me if I am. And then the department appealed to the Supreme Court saying, no, let us lay them off, and don't make us wait for the court case. And SCOTUS went, yeah, go ahead. You can still lay them off. So they're not laying off an additional 1,400 employees. This is the same 1,400 employees that were affected a couple months ago. Would I be shocked if I saw tomorrow that they're moving this function to this agency or this function to this agency? I wouldn't be shocked. But if they do, it doesn't matter for PSLF purposes, you know, and for first of all, it doesn't matter for the terms and conditions of your loan. It doesn't change the contract of your loan if they move agencies. PSLF is processed by a vendor. So you might not even see a blip in the process of PSLF if they change agencies. And the vast majority of the activities on your loans are done by vendors and servicers anyway. Where I do think there would be potential slowdowns are things like FAFSA, website updates, getting new employers approved. It's my long-winded way of saying I don't think the Department of Ed's going away. It could be hobbled a little more, but in the end, it should not affect your day-to-day for the most part. All right, if there's nothing else, I'm going to give it back. I think I'm supposed to give it back to Tiffany.
Yes, thanks, Betsy. That was incredible. I learned a ton. I hope everyone who's on this call has learned a ton already. I did want to spend a couple minutes going back to the neg regs, and Betsy, thank you for that insider information about what happened during rulemaking. I thought it was invaluable and really helpful. So I want to turn a little bit to like what you can do. So if you were benefiting from PSLF, if this is something that you were looking to for your employees, if you personally are benefiting from it, if you were a leader of a nonprofit and you were trying to attract and retain the extremely important workforce that you need to be providing the services to your communities every day, I want to give you a couple like action items. So first, as Betsy said, first thing you should do if you are benefiting from this or your employees are benefiting from this, make sure that they go and fill out their certification forms on the PSLF help tool. Really simple. It's in the slides. You can Google PSLF help tool right now and fill it out. The question at the end about if you're an employer, how you can help. This is something that you should regularly bring up on team meetings, or if during orientation when you hire someone new. You don't need to go into, do you have student loan debt? What is it? How much is it? You don't need to get very invasive. You can just say, hey, if you have federal loans, we as a 501c3 employer, I'm only talking to 501c3 right now, we are qualified eligible employers for PSLF. And so you should go on today and put on your PSLF help tool to certify your employment. And a supervisor can certify that, an HR representative, the executive director or CEO, just someone at the organization has to certify it. It's really simple. It takes about 5 minutes and everyone should do that. So that's the first thing you should do. Going to the negotiated rulemaking and kind of where we stand. As Betsy mentioned, right now, we are waiting to see if this proposed rule comes out, if there is a comment period, how you can actually submit comments. As Betsy mentioned several times, and as a couple of the questions in the Q&A showed, we're not really in normal times. Um, if they are trying to disband the Department of Education, where the different, servicers are going to be moved, like we're just kind of in a weird time. But if this period opens up to submit comments, we are asking you, NCN is asking you to please submit comments. And the reason for this is what Betsy mentioned, is there's this clock that would be ticking on whether these proposed regs would go into effect, or how this would actually play out. And if they are going to try to restrict who is eligible, as we said many, many times on this call, all 501c3 organizations, charitable organizations, are eligible employers. If they're trying to restrict it under what they said in the executive order, that is going to affect a lot of organizations, or could affect organizations. You shouldn't be changing anything right now, but it could affect your organization in the future. And so you should be submitting comments on those changes, or just the importance of PSLF in general. So this is what these changes could do. They could make it more challenging to attract your workforce. They could distract from the local needs that you are providing, to the services that you're providing, the gaps that you are filling in your communities. It's a distraction from your missions. It's a distraction from time that you spend every day serving your communities. We don't want these, what is a very clear line right now, all 501c3s as eligible employers, to be murkied, to be less clear, to be more confusing. It does not matter who you are serving or your mission. We believe that you are not performing illegal activities. As long as you are not performing illegal activities, you are an eligible employer. And so regardless of what you do, the communities you serve, the missions that you are trying to advance, you should not have political interference. You should not be afraid of retribution or removal from this program. And because of that, this is what we want you to do, is submit these comments if this comment period opens up. Next slide. So we expect, or we think this is going to open up. We think there's going to be a 30-day period. So prepare now. It doesn't need to be a long, drawn out comment. It doesn't need to be this beautifully written thing. It can just be very simple. And all we're asking you to do is share your story. And so start thinking about that now, in case we have a short period of time to do this. Next slide. So what should you include? What your organization does, who you are, what your mission is, what you do every day, who you serve every day, the gap that you are filling in your community, your local need that you live every day. No one can tell that story better than you. And you probably already have it written out somewhere. So that's the first thing you want to share. Then you want to share about the benefits of PSLF, the importance of how this, if you're the leader of your organization, if you're the executive director, or the president, if you're in the HR department or the operations, how this benefits your workforce. If you benefit from it individually, you can share that. Your personal story. Remember, these are public, on the record submission, so you don't want to share too much that you don't feel should be public. Share how this affects your organization. And then you can just simply say, all 501c3s are eligible employers. That is a very clear, as Betsy said many times, and as I am telling you right now, it's a very clear line. And so as a 501c3, you are an eligible employer. And so you don't want this to be confusing. And so this program helps you and enables you to work at the nonprofit that you serve and the communities that you serve. Next slide. So the bottom line is, it doesn't need to be polished, doesn't need to be pretty, it just needs to be honest. Tell your story, talk about PSLF. It shouldn't take you very long, and it can make a huge difference. So we will share these resources out if this comment period opens up. And we will make sure that you are equipped and know where to submit the comments. Next slide. So thank you so much. We're actually going to end a little bit early. Please check out the resources that Public Service Promise has on their website. Check out our resources, sign up for your state association, sign up for our newsletters. You can do that on our webpage. We will provide all of this in a follow-up email with the recording and the slides. Betsy, you have the last word. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. I was just sort of scrolling through the questions. Everybody had some really excellent questions, and I appreciate that. I guess the last thing is just, if you're interested in NEGREG, there is a negotiated rulemaking page on the Department of Ed's website. They have all the proposals. If they haven't already, they're going to post the recordings, because all the NEGREG sessions are public record. So if you wanted to watch, and if you do decide to watch, look for day 2, because if nothing else, I'm telling everybody I established my legacy during that NEGREG, because I'm pretty confident that I am the first person to ever use the term chaos pajamas on the public record. And I did that on day 2. So my legacy is established. So watch for that. And thanks to Public Service Promise and to Tiffany and her group for holding this. The more people that we get to educate, the better. And I love it. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.